What's going on here? I know it's your boy Little T. Back in full effect. You already know how I'm rocking, man. Hey, man, check it out, check it out, check it out. So we got the SpongeBob license theory. Y'all know SpongeBob could never get that license. That boy was some shit at driving. But yeah, man, ready to see what they talking about. 'Cause I think low-key Mrs. Puff was hating on him sometimes.
SpongeBob is purposely failing his
'Cause
driving
even
test,
Patrick
and I'm
told him
gonna
how to
watch
drive.
every single boating school episode to prove this. The first ever episode is named Boating School from season 1. It starts off with SpongeBob getting ready for his 38th boating exam.
Damn.
The boating exam starts with an oral exam, which SpongeBob aces, which kind of makes him look like a genius, but then he gets in the boat. SpongeBob starts to drive the boat, and he floors it and crashes, and Miss Puff blows up, which is something we also will see a lot during this video. Anyways though, the episode goes on with Patrick putting a walkie-talkie in SpongeBob's head so he can speak to him and give him the answers for the test. Here's where we get the first evidence SpongeBob is faking how bad he is at driving.
That's what I'm
Patrick's beaming
saying.
at SpongeBob's head and giving him the answers like turn left, turn on the car. I don't believe you could throw a random person in a car and just tell them what to do and they would just drive as perfect as SpongeBob.
Right.
SpongeBob obviously has driving skills, and it shows here. As the episode progresses, SpongeBob almost reaches the finish line, but right before he does, he tells Miss Puff he cheated, and he never crosses the finish line. SpongeBob fails his driving test, and instead of being sad about it, he's actually happy he'll get to attend back in Miss Puff's class next semester. This is something I also want to touch on, but not yet. He then unicycles away, which I also think is crazy, because personally, I think that's harder than driving a car. The next episode, Hall Monitor, starts with SpongeBob getting elected Hall Monitor and spending the entire class preaching about how grateful he is and how important this job is. He wastes the
Hall
entire class with his
Monitor.
speech, and Miss Puff feels bad, so she lets him wear the officer outfit for the rest of the day. This is where we get a glimpse into the power SpongeBob receives from being Mrs. Puff's student. He goes into the city and literally becomes a wanted criminal and destroys Bikini Bottom. In the end, SpongeBob gets surrounded by a bunch of cops and is about to go to jail until Miss Puff shows up. The cops realize she is responsible for him, and she goes to jail instead. Now imagine if in the last episode SpongeBob passed his test. He wouldn't have been able to go out and do all these bad things and get away with it. Miss Puff is literally his get out of jail free card, and this will happen a lot. No free rides start off with SpongeBob
I'm mad like them
failing
boss
the
was
driving
really
test
holding her.
again. Mrs. Puff is sick of him always failing and wants to get rid of him, so she decides to just pass him and give him the license, which is obviously a really bad idea, and Miss Puff realizes this. And when she does, she tries to steal SpongeBob's boat, and it ends pretty bad. SpongeBob doesn't really get to enjoy his
beat her
license in this
ass.
episode, and there isn't much driving from him except failing his test, but the episode still does end with Mrs. Puff going to jail. The next episode, New Student Starfish, is where I want to really focus on what I said earlier about SpongeBob enjoying school more than his license. So Patrick decides to attend boating school with SpongeBob, and they arrive 3 hours early. You have to love the
Damn.
class so much to show up that early, because I would never.
3
He then
hours
shows Patrick
early is
around like it's
crazy.
the most beautiful, astonishing place he's ever seen. He also brags about his golden stars, which he talks about like it's his
noodles.
purpose for living. It seems like this is a schedule for SpongeBob that he enjoys, and I can't see him ever giving this up just to drive a boat, especially since it wouldn't change much of his life. He seems to get around fine and enjoys his life to the fullest without a boat. Anyways though, the episode doesn't have any boat driving, just SpongeBob and Patrick fighting over golden stars. If you wanted to counter my argument, you would probably show me the next episode, Driven to Tears. This episode starts off as usual, SpongeBob failing his driving test, except this time Patrick comes to support him and gets mad he failed, so he takes the test to see if it's rigged, but he
Where your
passes the
pants
test
at?
and gets a brand new free car and then rubs it in SpongeBob's face. This really upsets SpongeBob and drives him crazy with jealousy, and this is exactly why it's a great counter argument. Why would he be purposely failing his test if he's jealous of Patrick's car? Well, because SpongeBob had no idea Patrick would be taking the test. He did his little thing of failing the test and got to see what would have happened if he didn't do that. That might be a major reach, but it also could be because he felt he lost his friend, because Patrick was spending more time with the car than SpongeBob. Anyways though, he tears up Patrick's license and goes to jail
Petty
for
as
littering,
shit,
which is
and
kind of karma for
smiling,
the amount of
happy as
times Mrs.
shit.
Puff got locked up. Now an episode that helps my argument. Mrs. Puff, you're fired. In this episode, Mrs. Puff loses her job because she is deemed a bad teacher, since SpongeBob has failed his test 1,000,000 times. So they bring in Bikini Bottom's best teacher to come teach SpongeBob.
I
He does
remember,
pretty great.
yo.
SpongeBob learns how to drive blindfolded, which like, come on, you can't tell me that SpongeBob can't drive. I could never drive.
Damn, he
blindfolded.
bit that
But
bitch.
As soon as SpongeBob gets in the car with the man who can pass him, he drives completely insane and destroys Bikini Bottom. And I'm pretty sure kills the driving instructor in the process, which is crazy. Not only did SpongeBob fail his test with the best instructor, he learned how to drive blindfolded and still failed. That doesn't even make sense. Not even someone who is bad at driving could drive the way he drives. It just has to be on purpose. Anyways though, after all this crazy driving and murdering, SpongeBob once again faces no consequences. The next episode, Picture Day, doesn't have much to do with his boating skills. It's just an episode that shows how important this class is to him and what he will go through for this class. I won't focus too much on this one. The next episode, Boat Smarts, is an educational boating lesson, starring Squidward and SpongeBob. This episode really just highlights how awful of a driver SpongeBob is. But
and
here's
how good Squidward was. I remember that one.
And SpongeBob. An awful driver is someone who drives under the speed limit, probably texts and drives, maybe runs a red light, doesn't check their mirrors, normal stuff. But then there's SpongeBob, who literally does not care and destroys Bikini Bottom on a regular and probably kills a lot of fish, and seems to also be aware of what he is doing. In this episode, he drives full speed into a one-way with no care in the world, just reading a magazine.
Just drag it!
An awful driver, or just someone who feels like they can do whatever they want with no consequences. I mean, Miss Puff would probably go to jail anyways. The next episode, Nautical Novice, is an episode that highlights how smart SpongeBob can actually be. SpongeBob decides to study the entire history of boats in one night, right before a field trip to the boating museum. He does this so he can impress Mrs. Puff and maybe get his license.
Damn,
and let me tell you,
you,
he's a genius. He memorized everything about every single boat, which means SpongeBob is smarter than most people give him credit for. I would need to read a book like 6 times before I could remember anything. SpongeBob's idea almost worked too. You see, he thought he was driving one of the most complicated boats, which even if he wasn't, he still knew how and what to do, which also makes no sense because he can't figure out the first step on a simple little driving boat. But nonetheless, this is extremely impressive and shows that SpongeBob is capable and very smart. I mean, this dude is literally a fry cook, and I can tell you from experience, driving is way easier than fast food. Anyways, like I said, he wasn't driving the boat, but Mrs. Puff thought he was, and he almost got his license. But when she found out he wasn't driving it, she tore the license up. And boating buddies, Squidward joins SpongeBob in boating class after trying to get away from him.
Me for yo, SpongeBob be on some weird shit with Squidward.
So he sped off in his boat and ran over a stop sign. I like this episode because it puts SpongeBob with 2 people who have a very similar relationship to him. SpongeBob makes Squidward's and Mrs. Puff's lives miserable and refuses to see it that way. In his mind, they love him and he is their best friends, which is shown after SpongeBob draws an example of what happened before Squidward's ticket. It's just a drawing of Squidward and SpongeBob saying, "Best boating buddies ever." He is so unself-aware, or maybe it's on purpose, but I won't dive into that. SpongeBob then takes his driving test with Squidward and Mrs. Puff, and like always, drives insane and crashes into everything. But at least this time, Squidward gets the consequences and not Mrs. Puff. The next episode, Ditching, starts with SpongeBob's favorite heroes, Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, announcing their book signing. So SpongeBob ditches boating class to go see them. After this, he gets looped into doing a bunch of other things, and we can see his stress as he tries to get back to boating school. He gets back to class after escaping tar quicksand and kind of death, and Mrs. Puff didn't even realize until he snitched on himself, saying he will never ditch again. This episode didn't have much to do with driving, but shows how important Mrs. Puff is to him. He literally accepted death, but then fights it just for Mrs. Puff. Summer Job is an episode that supports my point that fast food is harder than driving. So SpongeBob causes Mrs. Puff to crash into the Krusty Krab, and to pay off the debt, she has to work at the Krusty Krab. Keep in mind, his driving instructor, who thinks SpongeBob is so dumb, literally cannot handle the job, which could have been because of SpongeBob, but anyway, she ends up quitting and then littering and goes to jail. In jail, Mrs. Puff has to take a boating class,
stay going to jail.
Teacher, of course, is SpongeBob, which has to mean he really enjoys boating school to teach it. Also, I don't know how he qualified for the job without having a license, but whatever. The Hot Shot is another episode where SpongeBob is trained by someone else that isn't Mrs. Puff. What the hell is that? So a new kid, Tony Fast Jr., joins Mrs. Puff's classroom, whose dad is like a huge professional boat racer. Mrs. Puff takes this opportunity to make Tony Fast Jr. teach SpongeBob driving. And on his first drive with SpongeBob, he starts off pretty bad, but then he says 2 simple words: "Be cool." And SpongeBob drives perfectly, which, just like the first episode, boating school
don't make no sense.
He drives for the rest of the episode pretty perfectly, which shows that SpongeBob truthfully is a great boat driver when he wants to be. Now, of course, even with SpongeBob driving good, it always has to end with him going insane and crashing and inflating Mrs. Puff. I want you to focus on his smile as this happens. Dude knows what he's doing. In Oral Report, SpongeBob tries to fight his public speaking anxiety for boating class, which is another episode that shows how important he takes his class, since this is probably his 1 millionth time presenting a boating speech, and he's still taking it this serious. Also, in this episode, he flees boating school and drives perfectly away until spotted by the cops and crashes into a bunch of houses, which might have been on purpose, at least I think so, because then he finally delivers his speech and gets Mrs. Puff sent to jail. In Demolition Doofus, Mrs. Puff signs up SpongeBob for a demolition derby because she believes he could die in the derby, which is wild. but he literally beats a bunch of huge professional demolition derby drivers without even trying, and I won't lie, this is definitely suspicious. No quote-unquote bad driver would do as good as SpongeBob did. SpongeBob knows what he is doing and is very talented at destroying things, which is exactly what he tries to do when he drives. In Bumper to Bumper, SpongeBob fails his test again, like always, and Mrs. Puff tries to find a new way to make him pass. So she takes him out in the middle of nowhere, where there's nothing he can destroy. She tells him to just focus on the road, and he goes into like a psychedelic trance that makes him into, once again, an amazing driver. Even on the highway, until Mrs. Puff freaks out telling him he's on the highway, and from there everything goes pretty haywire. But SpongeBob was driving perfectly, and I think once Miss Puff doubted his abilities, he realized he needed to go back into his bad driving persona. Anyways, he drives crazy and all over the place and lands Mrs. Puff in jail. And to his sauce, Mr. Krabs tries to teach SpongeBob how to drive, and he crashes consistently into the Krusty Krab and gives Mr. Krabs a huge bill and a ticket in the end. It seems whoever teaches this man how to drive only receives torture. Also, SpongeBob drives bad this entire episode. Burst Your Bubble isn't much of a boat driving episode, as SpongeBob blows a bubble car and drives that instead, and then everyone starts driving it. In this episode also, Mrs. Puff, the boating instructor, tries driving a bubble boat and fails miserably, and needs to be coached by SpongeBob. This being another example of SpongeBob being smarter than he's getting credit for. Teacher's Pest is an episode where Mr. Krabs and Plankton attend boating school. Most of the episode is centered around them and their beef, but if you focus on SpongeBob, you can see him being a perfect student and actually completing the driving course before blowing up the entire world. But he did complete the driving course, and without any person giving him advice. Lighthouse Louie starts off with SpongeBob failing his driving test and hitting the lighthouse and having to clean and fix it, and he finds snails, and that's pretty much the entire episode. In Potato Puff, Mrs. Puff gets sick of always crashing with SpongeBob, so she puts a stunt double potato with a speaker in the car with him while she chills inside. In this episode, we can see SpongeBob once again drive perfectly, which is also suspicious because how come when real Miss Puff is in the car, he instantly crashes? It seems he knew this was a potato and teased Miss Puff on purpose, which worked well since Miss Puff also ends up in jail in the end. Yellow Pavement is a sequel to the episode Boat Smarts, which is just another episode showing how bad of a driver he is. He tortures Squidward and injures him into the biggest cast I've ever seen. He then teases Mrs. Puff and makes her mad. Now, I don't think SpongeBob is purposely like trying to make Mrs. Puff and Squidward's life miserable, but I genuinely think he just enjoys their company, and in his mind, they are his bestest friends. So he doesn't want to pass the test because he cherishes their relationship, and he doesn't want to lose her or the wonderful classroom that has become a part of his schedule. Now, if this isn't enough, I'll just make it really simple. In the first SpongeBob movie, SpongeBob drives absolutely perfect when driving.
Oh my god, dummy, I just realized he was really bipping the fucking cheeseburger. That's real shit, bro. How the fuck he was bipping the cheeseburger, but he can't pass a boating test? Damn, I just be
In the
shit.
first SpongeBob movie, SpongeBob drives absolutely perfect when driving the Krabby Patty boat. And I don't know. Maybe I'm just overthinking. If you want to watch me overthink some more, you can,
shit, I forgot about that. But hey, man, let's go do it for the video. Yeah. At this point, it just sounds like SpongeBob doing this shit on purpose, man.
Overthinking. You could just.
But yeah, man, let's go do it for the video. Let me see the comments below. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. Hope you enjoyed the video, man. Peace.